The Pacific at night, black as ink, lit only by tracer fire. Across these haunted waters, American PT boats slashed through waves at 50 knots, launching torpedoes into the dark. They were hunted by aircraft, shelled by destroyers, yet struck with surgical fury. It was David versus Goliath. But David had 3 Packard engines and a heart full of vengeance. By mid-1943, the Solomon Islands were no longer paradise. They were purgatory, a battlefield stretching hundreds of miles where sea and jungle devoured men and machines alike. The fight for these islands wasn't about territory. It was about lifelines, the arteries of the Pacific War. Whoever controlled them controlled the war's future. To the north, Rabaul, Japan's fortress. A volcano-ringed city turned fortress, bristling with Zero fighters, submarines, and anti-aircraft guns. To the south, the shattered remnants of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and New Georgia. American blood had already turned those jungles red. But the fight was far from over. Every night, Japanese destroyers roared through the dark to deliver men and ammunition to their garrisons. They called it the Tokyo Express. The Americans called it suicide on schedule. Those destroyers were fast, up to 35 knots, and heavily armed. They moved in tight convoys, hugging the black silhouette of the islands, running without lights, trusting only their navigation and instinct. And to intercept them, the U.S. Navy turned to something small, fast, and ferocious. Patrol Torpedo Boats, PTs. Wooden hulls, 80 feet long, powered by 3 Packard engines that screamed like demons. No armor, no radar, just torpedoes, machine guns, and guts. They were nicknamed the Mosquito Fleet. Small enough to sting a destroyer, fast enough to disappear before the enemy could swat back. These boats would prowl the sea at night, crews of a dozen young men armed with torpedoes that could sink ships 10 times their size. They hunted shadows, ambushed giants, and fought battles measured in seconds. One of those men was Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. His boat, PT-109, became legend, but in the Solomons, it was just one among many. On the night of August 1, 1943, PT-109 drifted quietly near Kolombangara Island. The moon hung low, pale and cold. The air was heavy with mist and the smell of gasoline. Kennedy's crew scanned the horizon, waiting, listening. Then they heard it. A low rumble, distant but growing, the sound of engines. The Tokyo Express was coming. Kennedy ordered the engines started. The Packards came alive with a roar that seemed to shake the ocean itself. The crew prepared the torpedoes. Every man on that deck knew what was at stake. Moments later, black shapes appeared out of the mist, Japanese destroyers slicing through the water like knives. "Range," Kennedy called out. "Less than 2,000 yards," came the answer. He turned the wheel sharply. "Fire 1!" A blinding flash. The first torpedo streaked into the black water. Then a second. Then a third. The seconds crawled by. Then a distant explosion tore through the night. Flames erupted from one of the Japanese ships. The men on PT-109 cheered. But the celebration lasted only a moment. The enemy had spotted them. Gunfire ripped through the dark. Water spouted up in towering white pillars as shells screamed overhead. The PTs scattered, weaving, ducking, vanishing into the black. PT-109 turned hard to starboard, too hard. In the chaos, a Japanese destroyer, Amagiri, bore down on her from the darkness, unseen, until it was too late. In an instant, steel met wood. The destroyer sliced PT-109 in half. The impact was deafening. Flames engulfed the water. Men were thrown overboard, gasping in the blackness. 2 were killed instantly. Kennedy and the survivors clung to wreckage, swimming through the oil-slicked sea for hours before reaching a tiny, uninhabited island. It was one of many tragedies that defined the Solomons, proof that courage alone couldn't always outpace fate. The Solomon Sea campaign wasn't one grand battle. It was a relentless series of clashes that never truly stopped. Every night, the same dance played out. Darkness, engines, explosions, silence. The Japanese destroyers were the giants of the night, fast, disciplined, deadly. But the PT crews learned quickly. They became masters of hit-and-run tactics, hugging the shorelines, ambushing from cover, vanishing before the enemy's guns could find them. They operated from rough bases, jungle clearings with makeshift docks, oil drums for supply depots, and tents crawling with mosquitoes. The heat was suffocating. Everything smelled of fuel, sweat, and salt. Repairs were done by hand, often in the open. If a boat took damage, the crew fixed it themselves, hammering, welding, patching holes with whatever they could find. And yet, when the engine started, something changed. The men who looked exhausted, beaten, half-starved, suddenly came alive. When those Packards roared, one veteran said, "You forgot how tired you were. You forgot how scared you were. The sound of those engines, it was like your heartbeat." The PTs became the Navy's daggers, silent, lethal, unrelenting. Every engagement was a lesson in chaos. The PTs had no radar in those early months. They relied on sight, hearing, and instinct. Sometimes they caught glimpses of phosphorescent wakes, the faint glow of an enemy's propeller in the black water. Other times the only warning was a shadow where no shadow should be. "Out there," said one sailor, "you didn't just see the enemy, you felt them." They learned to use the environment, hugging the shoreline, waiting behind reefs, blending into the reflections of moonlight on the waves. When the attack came, it came fast. Engines flared, torpedoes fired, the ocean exploded into fire and thunder. They fought destroyers, barges, and even sometimes aircraft. The PTs would turn their guns skyward, raking the heavens with .50 caliber tracer fire as Japanese planes dove from above. The roar of engines and the rattle of guns blended into one long scream. And when it was over, silence. Just the hiss of waves and the smell of burning fuel drifting across the sea. By late 1943, the PT squadrons had become a crucial part of the Allied push through the Solomons. They intercepted supply lines, rescued downed airmen, and shadowed convoys. They were everywhere, invisible until it was too late. The Japanese began to call them the Black Wolves of the Sea. For every destroyer they failed to stop, there was another they crippled, torpedoes slamming into hulls under the cover of darkness. But it wasn't without cost. Many PTs never came back. Some vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no survivors, just another story swallowed by the Pacific. Yet somehow, the men kept going. They fought for each other, for the camaraderie of the crew, the shared madness of riding a wooden rocket through hell. And for some, it became personal. They weren't just fighting a war, they were avenging friends who'd never made it back. By the winter of 1943, the Solomons had become a graveyard of ships. The waters glowed faintly from burning oil and drifting debris. The air was thick with smoke, the horizon always stained red by distant fires. The PT men started calling it the Night Sea. They said it wasn't the ocean anymore. It was something alive, something that watched, something that waited. For the Japanese, the terror was just as real. Their sailors began to fear the darkness itself. The mere whisper of an engine in the distance could send a chill through an entire convoy. They'd fire into the void, wasting ammunition, desperate to hit something they couldn't see. The Americans turned fear into a weapon. One officer later said, "We didn't own the sea, but we owned the night." The Solomon Sea campaign dragged on, battle after battle, island after island. Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Vella Lavella, Columbangara, names that blurred together in smoke and memory. Each victory came with a cost, and each loss was a reminder that survival was measured in seconds. But the PT men knew something the Japanese did not. Time was on their side. The tide was turning. The Allied fleets were growing stronger. The skies above the Pacific were filling with American planes. The PT boats, small, wooden, almost insignificant, had played their part. They'd bought time. They'd harassed the enemy.
They'd proven that courage and ingenuity could stand against might. And in doing so, they'd written one of the most overlooked chapters of naval warfare. When the Solomon campaign finally ended, the survivors returned to battered docks and makeshift bases, older, quieter, and forever changed. Some left their boats behind, still scarred with bullet holes, as if frozen mid-battle. One crewman carved 3 words into the hull of his boat before leaving: "We lived fast." Because they had. In the years that followed, historians would call the PT boats a footnote, small craft in a massive war. But for the men who rowed them, they were more than that. They were the cutting edge of desperation, the Navy's experiment in speed and audacity. They fought giants in the dark, and won just enough to make the impossible seem possible. The Solomon Sea still holds their secrets: rusted torpedoes, buried in coral, twisted propellers half sunk in sand. But the echoes of those nights, the roar of engines, the shouts of men, the thunder of torpedoes, still drift through the waves. Because in that narrow stretch of ocean, under the ghostly moonlight of 1943, the Pacific wasn't ruled by aircraft carriers or battleships. It belonged to the few, the reckless, the brave. The men of the PT boats, the engines of thunder in the Solomon Seas.
By the winter of 1943, the men of the Mosquito Fleet had learned to live with the dark. It wasn't just a condition of battle. It was a companion, an enemy, a mirror. The Solomons at night were an ocean of silence and smoke, where the line between courage and insanity blurred into black water. They called it Torpedo Alley. For months, the PT boats had hunted through these waters, between New Georgia, Columbangara, and Bougainville, against impossible odds. Destroyers 30 times their size, bristling with guns. Transports loaded with troops. Barges creeping along the coast like shadows. And always the sea, vast, indifferent, swallowing the wreckage and the dead with the same calm. The men had come to understand that fighting here wasn't about size or strength. It was about nerve. Each PT crew developed its own rhythm, its own instincts. They learned how to see in darkness, how to listen to the sound of an approaching wake, how to read the faint shimmer of a phosphorescent trail left by a passing ship. Some swore they could even smell the exhaust of Japanese destroyers before spotting them, a mix of burning oil and salt carried by the wind. You couldn't always see them, one sailor said later. Sometimes you just felt them. The sea went quiet, and you knew they were there. A typical mission began just before sunset. Engines idled as crews loaded torpedoes and ammunition, checked the twin 50 cals, and topped off fuel tanks. Men moved with quiet precision, their faces streaked with sweat and engine grease. Every gesture was a ritual, every motion second nature. They didn't wear standard uniforms, too hot, too restrictive. Instead, they went to battle in T-shirts, shorts, and worn deck shoes. Some wrapped bandanas around their heads to keep sweat out of their eyes. To an outsider, they looked like a gang of misfits. But on the water, they were artists of chaos. At dusk, they cast off. The sun sank into the horizon like a smoldering ember. Engines roared to life. 3 Packard V-12s, each producing over 1,200 horsepower. Their combined growl rolled across the sea like distant thunder. The boats accelerated to 30, then 40 knots. Spray kicked up around them. As night fell, the only light came from the faint glow of gauges and the ghostly shimmer of foam beneath the hull. They moved in small packs, 3 or 4 boats to a section, spread out just enough to cover more water, but close enough to see one another's silhouettes in the moonlight. Their commanders used hand signals, flashlights shielded with cloth, whispered words over radio static. The objective was simple: intercept the Tokyo Express. The execution, never simple. The Japanese destroyers came like ghosts themselves, silent, fast, deadly. They were masters of night navigation, trained for years in the art of evading detection. Their lookouts had eyes like hawks. Their gunners could hit a target by the muzzle flash alone. The PTs couldn't match their firepower, so they didn't try. Instead, they relied on deception, speed, and the oldest weapon of all, surprise. They'd use the coastline like a shield, slipping between small islands, cutting their engines to drift silently in the dark. If the moon was high, they'd hug the shadows of the jungle shore. If it was cloudy, they'd race wide, zigzagging through open sea. They called it dancing with giants. When contact came, it happened fast. A lookout would shout, "Ship dead ahead!" The helm swung hard over. Torpedo tubes were armed. The torpedoes, long, sleek cylinders of steel and fury, were their main weapon. Each one weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and could travel over a mile at 40 knots. But to launch them effectively, the PTs had to close within 1,000 yards, practically point-blank range against ships carrying 5-inch guns. That was the heart of the terror, getting close enough to strike without being blown apart first. Every time we went in, a torpedo man remembered, you could feel your chest tighten. We'd get so close you could see the glow of their cigarettes on deck. Once fired, the PT had to turn hard away, engine screaming, wake glowing white, praying the torpedo hit before the destroyer's guns found their mark. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. There were nights when the ocean lit up like day, tracer rounds tearing through the dark as shells exploded all around. Men dove for cover. Wood splintered. Fuel tanks caught on fire. A hit to the engine room could turn a PT into a floating inferno within seconds. Yet they went back out night after night. "You didn't think about dying," one crewman said quietly. "You just thought about the guy next to you. You wanted him to make it home." Over time, they developed tactics that turned desperation into doctrine. They began coordinating with aircraft, spotters during the day marking enemy routes so the PTs could ambush at night. They studied Japanese habits, the times they ran convoys, the routes they favored, the silhouettes of their ships. They learned to predict movement by instinct. Some squadrons experimented with bait tactics, one PT drawing fire while others attacked from the flank. Others used deception, shining small lights behind palm trees along shorelines to trick destroyers into firing at phantom targets. One night off Vella Gulf, a PT section set up a trap. They cut their engines, drifted in silence, waiting. Then, out of the haze came the glow of destroyer exhausts. The PTs opened fire simultaneously, a deadly cross pattern of torpedoes that turned the sea into chaos. When the flashes faded, 2 Japanese destroyers were sinking, and the rest had fled. That night, the Mosquito fleet had proven that even giants could bleed. But the sea was merciless. For every successful strike, there were nights of terror and loss. Boats disappeared into the dark, sometimes hit by shell fire, sometimes lost to the sea itself. Engines failed, torpedoes misfired, men drowned without a trace. Those who survived learned to live with the ghosts of those who didn't. You'd hear an explosion in the distance, and you'd know somebody wasn't coming back. But you couldn't stop. You just kept your course. You had to. Their world had shrunk to the cockpit, the compass, the hum of the engines, and the faces around them. Every sound, every creak, every ripple became amplified. The darkness pressed in from all sides. They joked to stay sane. They smoked and cursed and argued. But when the engine started, they became one. It wasn't discipline that kept them together. It was faith. Faith in each other, in their boat, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, the night would end. Over time, the PT crews became legends within their own ranks. Each base told stories of daring escapes and miraculous hits. They carved names into their hulls, like Thunderbolt, Devil's Dart, Sea Fang. Some painted shark teeth on their bows. Others kept souvenirs, fragments of enemy ships, torpedo fins, empty shell casings, reminders of nights they'd survived. But behind the bravado, the toll was real. Fatigue ate at them. The tropical heat, the constant dampness, the endless noise of engines, it all wore men down. Malaria spread through the ranks. Rations spoiled. Mail from home arrived months late, if at all. Still, they fought on. To them, the Solomons weren't just coordinates on a map. They were the entire world. A world made of water, fire, and willpower. By late 1943, their tactics had evolved into a kind of dark art. They'd mastered the use of wake and wave to mask their approach. They'd learned to strike not at the heart of the convoy, but at its edges, cutting off stragglers, forcing confusion. They used moonlight as a weapon, shining attacks from the shadows on moonlit nights, or from the glare itself when the enemy expected darkness. They even experimented with radar pickets, one boat equipped with crude early radar guiding the others into position. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Their hits increased. Their losses decreased. They'd turned improvisation into innovation.
"We weren't following manuals," said one lieutenant. "We were writing them." And yet, for all their cunning, the fear never left. One night, off Columbangara, a PT section found itself ambushed. Shells erupted from the dark without warning. One boat, PT-239, took a direct hit. The explosion ripped her apart, fuel and flame cascading across the sea. The other PTs swerved away, firing blindly into the black. When dawn came, only fragments of the boat remained. Charred wood, floating gear, a life belt. The survivors of other boats searched for hours, but the sea had already taken them. After a while, one sailor said softly, "You stopped trying to count the names. There were too many." Despite everything, morale held, stubborn, defiant, because deep down, they knew they were part of something larger. Every torpedo that struck home weakened Japan's hold on the Pacific. Every night mission drew the enemy's eyes and guns away from the main fleet. They were the knife in the dark, cutting the arteries of a giant. And when the big ships, the cruisers, the carriers, finally arrived to retake the Solomons, it was the PTs who paved the way.
They'd been the first in. They'd endured the worst. And though they'd never make the headlines, they left their mark on the map. As one commander wrote in his log, "Destroyers fight to control the sea. We fight to make sure there's still a sea left to control." By the time 1944 dawned, the Mosquito fleet had become a symbol of resilience. The men who'd started as outcasts, too wild for the big ships, too restless for garrison life, had become veterans of one of the most intense naval campaigns in history. They'd turned speed into strategy, fear into fury, wood into a weapon. The Solomons were no longer a battlefield. They were a proving ground. And as the Allied fleet advanced north toward the Philippines, the PTs followed, ready to repeat the cycle in new waters. But those who'd fought in the Solomons carried something the new man couldn't imagine. The memory of nights where the sea itself felt alive, where death whispered just beyond the bow, and where every dawn felt like a miracle. You'd wake up, said one veteran, and realize you were still here. And you'd think, maybe that's enough. They called it Torpedo Alley. But to the men who survived it, it was something else. A crucible of fear and courage, where the smallest boats fought the biggest war.
The nights blurred together after that. We'd learned to tell the time by the pitch of the engines and the way the horizon glowed, sometimes with lightning, more often with burning ships. The Solomon Sea never really slept. Even when the stars looked calm, you could feel the ocean trembling with what was coming. They called it Tokyo Express Alley. We just called it Hell's Highway. By mid-1943, Command wanted the enemy convoy stopped at any cost. Intelligence said the Japanese were pouring men and ammunition through Blackett Strait, slipping past our patrols between New Georgia and Colamangara. Destroyers bigger than our dreams, running blacked out and silent, cutting through the water like knives. And us, 80 feet of plywood, 4 torpedoes, and guts. The first time I saw one of those destroyers appear out of the dark, I thought my heart would explode. One moment, empty ocean. The next, a wall of steel sliding past us, so close you could see men on deck smoking. Then their searchlight tore the night open. We didn't think. We throttled forward, dropped smoke, and fired. I still remember the hiss as our torpedo left the tube, a white streak disappearing into black. 10 seconds later, the sea erupted. That blast felt like the ocean itself screamed. Flame rose 50 feet high. When the shock wave hit us, we thought we'd been torn in half. But when the smoke cleared, she was listing hard. Japanese crew scrambling over rails. We'd drawn first blood in Blackett Strait. After that, we weren't kids anymore. The Solomon campaign became a cycle of darkness and fire. Each night we went out, we expected not to come back. Our boats ran in pairs, 3-man teams standing at the ready, skipper on the wheel, torpedo man crouched by the tubes, engineer coaxing the Packards like they were racehorses. We moved fast, low, quiet. Radar was primitive, sometimes broken, so we relied on eyes, ears, and the faint shimmer of phosphorescence along a hull to know the enemy was there. You could always tell when the Japanese were near. The air changed. The sea went still, the kind of silence that made you swallow hard and listen. Then, a faint vibration, a far-off churn. The Express was coming. We'd hug the coastline, using the islands as cover, waiting until they passed broadside. The trick was patience. Too soon, and your torpedoes missed. Too late, and you were dead. We'd light the fuse only when we could read the Japanese call signs painted on the stern. I can still see the faces of the men on PT 109 when we met off New Georgia. Kennedy was younger than most of us, but he carried himself like he'd been at sea forever. We joked about who'd bag the next destroyer. He grinned and said, "You just worry about making it to breakfast." None of us knew what was coming for him weeks later, that collision in the black water that would turn him into a legend. But that night, all of us were just ghosts chasing ghosts. Blackett Strait was supposed to break them. Instead, it broke us too. The Japanese learned. They started launching flares that turned midnight into noon. We'd squint against the light, blind, praying they hadn't seen the wake of our boats. Then came the shells. Long-range, 5-inch guns, each one sounded like thunder rolling across the sea. When those shells landed close, the air itself stung. One hit PT-157 dead on the bow. She vanished, gone before anyone could scream. The concussion lifted our boat clean off the water. I still see the engineer, Mac, thrown against the dash, blood on his teeth as he laughed and yelled, "We're still running!" We were, but barely. We limped back to Tulagi with holes big enough to crawl through. The dock crew counted 67 patches needed. Someone asked the skipper why we kept going back out there. He said, because if we don't, the next convoy reaches Guadalcanal, and then we start this war all over again. We limped back to Tulagi with holes big enough to crawl through. The dock crew counted 67 patches needed. Someone asked the skipper why we kept going back out there. He said, because if we don't, the next convoy reaches Guadalcanal, and then we start this war all over again. By August, the nights got meaner. The Japanese pushed more barges south, hidden in coves and river mouths. Command turned us into hunters, search and burn. We prowled through the mangroves, engines idling low, our searchlights sweeping across drifting branches that looked too much like periscopes. More than once we opened fire on nothing but shadows, and more than once the shadows fired back. One night off Vella we stumbled into a nightmare. 4 Japanese destroyers, fresh out of Rabaul, cutting straight through our patrol line. There was no time for torpedoes. We went full throttle and scattered. Tracers stitched across the water, red and green, carving our wake. I remember diving for the deck, the smell of burnt cordite and salt in my lungs. The radio crackled with shouts, call signs, screams, static. We lost 3 boats in 10 minutes. PT-167 took a shell through her cockpit. She burned like a torch. Men jumped into the sea, their silhouettes framed by the glow. We circled back for survivors under fire. One of them, Seaman First Class Daniels, floated half-conscious, mumbling, "I saw the sky open up." We hauled him aboard, wrapped him in canvas, and kept running. He died before dawn. When the battle reports came in, they said it was a victory, that we'd forced the Express to retreat. But standing on that deck, watching the horizon bleed red, it didn't feel like any victory we knew. There's a sound that never leaves you, the hiss of burning fuel on salt water. It smells sweet, metallic. You can taste it on your tongue. Every man who served out there carries it somewhere deep, like a scar you can't wash away. After Vella, we began running rescue patrols too. Downed pilots, wrecked crews, anyone left drifting. One morning we found a lifeboat with 4 aviators clinging to it. They'd been out there 2 days, half mad from thirst. When we pulled them aboard, one of them grabbed my arm and said, "You boys don't get enough credit." I just laughed. Out here, credit didn't matter. Staying alive did. That was the thing about those nights. They stripped you down to what was real. Fear, friendship, duty. Everything else burned away in the gunfire. September brought the turning tide. The Japanese were bleeding. Their convoys ran smaller, faster, desperate. We pushed harder, deeper into their lanes. New radar sets gave us eyes in the dark, but even then, nothing was certain. One wrong reading and you were steering straight into the jaws. On the night of September 25th, PT-190 and PT-191 were running tandem near the Kolombangara Channel when radar picked up 4 fast contacts. We assumed destroyers. The skipper decided to intercept. We crept forward, engines whispering. At 2,000 yards, we fired 2 torpedoes each and turned hard to port. Seconds later, the sea split open. 2 enemy barges disintegrated, but their escorts answered with everything they had. The night became daylight. tracers, flares, the orange bloom of exploding ammo. We ducked behind smoke, swung wide, and went back in. Our torpedoes were gone, so we used the twin 50s, hammering at silhouettes in the firelight. One of the gunners screamed, "We're out of ammo!" The skipper shouted back, "Then throw your helmet!" And somehow we all laughed. That's how we survived, by laughing when death was inches away. When dawn finally came, the sea was littered with debris. Oil drums, life vests, splintered wood. The smell of burnt rubber hung in the air. Seagulls circled overhead, crying like they knew what we'd done. I stood by the rail, hands shaking from exhaustion, and thought about how small our boats looked against all that water. We'd started this war thinking we were invincible. By the Solomon campaign's end, we knew better. We weren't warriors out of legend. We were boys holding a line no one else could reach. Sometimes when the engines quieted and the wind was just right, you could hear the jungle whispering from shore. Frogs, insects, the faint hum of life untouched by war. That's when it hit you. The world didn't care who won out here. The ocean would wash over it all the same. But we cared, because those nights weren't just battles. They were promises kept. Promises to the men beside us, to the ones we lost, to the country waiting far beyond that horizon of fire. So we kept going, night after night, through smoke and storm, through fear and flame. And when the call came for one last run through the slot, none of us hesitated. We throttled up, engines roaring like thunder, and disappeared into the dark. Because that's what we were born for. To fight in the night, to strike from the shadows, to live and die as wolves of the Solomon Sea.